From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
John Kerry says he will soon step down as President Biden's climate envoy, with a parting shot this week at disinformation on electric vehicles, as the Supreme Court takes a case on whether there's a constitutional right to be homeless. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnists Kim Strassel and Alicia Finley. Let's start with a clip of John Kerry, President Biden's outgoing special climate envoy, at the World Economic Forum in Davos, asked to respond to some reports that companies are pulling back from the electric vehicle market.
There's been a very, very clear policy, which regrettably has been attacked by people who are engaged in high levels of disinformation. They've been trying to scare people about the range of vehicles, so there's range anxiety out there. But in addition to that, you've had some pullback because communities aren't moving fast enough to give permitting to deploy some of the renewables that we need.
Kim, this strikes me as a particularly bad week for John Kerry to be making this argument about EV disinformation, because given the freezing temperatures that we have seen in some areas of the United States, there have been all sorts of news stories in places that I don't think John Kerry would consider disinformation, like the New York Times, about EV drivers that are stuck, unable to get their cars to charge.
Correct. It is not disinformation, as has been reported by many news outlets, that Hertz is selling off a third of its EV fleet, in part because of the high cost of repairs of electric vehicles. Certain stats suggest that there's 78% more repairs on EV vehicles than on regular vehicles. It's not disinformation that batteries do not like and never have liked the cold. That's just basic physics. And a lot of people are unfortunately learning that in Chicago and elsewhere this week, as their cars won't start and won't hold a charge. It's not disinformation that they do have limited range, especially if it's cold out, for instance, or if it's hot and you're running temperature control in your car. It's not disinformation that there isn't an extensive network for charging stations and isn't likely to be for a long time. And it certainly isn't disinformation that these things can cost more than someone's firstborn to go buy one. They're very, very expensive. And that is the reason why EVs are not taking off. The government can wish all at once that it mandates this transition and forces people to get them, but it doesn't mean that people are going to like it. And while they still have choice, it's pretty clear that both consumers and some businesses out there that have to make decisions about EV fleets are deciding that they don't want some of these cars right now.
Here's a line from that New York Times story I mentioned about Chicago. It says this week, Ms. Rivera said she has awakened to find about a third of her car battery drained from the overnight cold. As temperatures plummeted, she spent hours every morning waiting in line and recharging the battery. And I believe she has a Tesla. She also said if you're waiting in the line for the Tesla charger and you only have 50 miles left on your battery, you're not going to make it, given the number of people that are queued up there in order to get the Tesla charge. Alicia, can you speak a little bit to the business imperatives here? Kim mentioned Hertz dumping some of its fleet. My understanding is there's also a news story in recent days about Ford cutting some production of one of its EV pickup trucks. Is it just that these companies are responding to the consumer demand, or maybe I should say the softening and the lack of demand for these cars?
All of the above. So in the case of Ford, the F-150, it announced today that it was cutting production at a factory in Michigan, cutting back one shift, and that would reassign a lot of the employees, those that didn't opt for early retirement, to some other factories to increase production of the gas-powered popular cars like the Bronco. And this is a shift based on consumer demand. That the F-150, it had high hopes for this pickup truck. And if you recall, when it was first unveiled, May 2021, it drew a lot of oohs and ahs from the press. At one point, it had a reservation list of around 200,000. Last year, it sold all of 24,000. And so now it is slashing production at its facility by about half. That has the potential to produce 150,000. So you can kind of guesstimate or extrapolate how many Lightnings it actually thinks it will be able to sell next year based on that. And it definitely seems that the reservation list of 200,000 has definitely declined. And one reason is, well, last year it increased prices by $20,000 for the vehicle, which put it out of financial range for many buyers. Another issue is that she ran into a number of manufacturing problems and defects that resulted in vehicle recalls. And the news of this has kind of spread online. And this has been actually true of a number of EVs that have been rolled out. They have more issues. Chevy has recently just announced that it's also asked its dealers to stop selling its electric Blazer because of software problems and some other glitches. Kind of ironic because Motor Trend magazine actually ranked the Blazer as the best SUV in 2024. But then all of a sudden you started seeing consumer complaints on social media of glitches, inoperable switches, batteries that wouldn't charge, screens that got frozen. And again, there were a number of them. So now it's asking its dealers to pause sales. And all this raises the question is, why are so many problems? It's not unusual to occasionally have a vehicle recall, but there seems to be a lot more problems with the EVs that are rolling out than you'd see with gas-powered cars. And actually, this is supported by a Consumer Reports survey that found that new EV owners report 78% more problems with their cars than gas-powered cars. And my hypothesis is that, well, the companies have been rushing to get these EVs out, and they may not have done due diligence in their designing and all their testing and the engineering. These are very complicated vehicles, partly because they rely a lot more on software than traditional gas-powered cars that run, the internal combustion engine. And so you're starting to see more defects. And of course, this is also contributing to the consumer hesitance. I mean, people aren't stupid. They do read online about cars before they go out to buy them. So it goes beyond just the EV range, which again is really a very salient issue to many people who don't live in, New York or, LA, who don't live in big cities and have to travel hundreds of miles a day, especially because another thing that isn't really, when you talk about misinformation, well, most of the misinformation has been on the left, and they don't really address a lot of the problems with the EVs, and one being that they get a lot less mileage on highways than they do on city streets. It's kind of the opposite of what it is with gas-powered cars, and hence why they lose charge a lot more quickly, too. And so there's actually been a lot of misinformation on the left about the benefits of EVs and the advantages, and consumers kind of figured it out, and that's why sales have been, I'd say, slowing. They're not really falling at this point, but they are not accelerating at the point that a lot of automakers thought they would be several years ago.
Hang tight. We'll be right back with more on this in a moment. Welcome back. Kim, I can't help but chuckle when I hear John Kerry describing range anxiety as disinformation, because although I don't own an electric vehicle, I myself experienced some range anxiety recently when I called an Uber that was an EV. It was relatively late at night. I was going home, and of course, you don't get to choose which Uber car comes to pick you up. And it turned out to be an EV. It wasn't a Tesla, though I forget the exact brand and model. And I get in and say hello to the driver, and he says, "You're my last ride of the night. Then I have to go and charge somewhere." And I said, "Well, I'm going about 20 or 25 miles. How much range do you have left?" And he said, 30 or something like that. And I offered to get out and call a different car because I didn't want this guy to be stranded. Self-starting entrepreneur trying to get the fare, and said it'd be fine. He'd figure it out. So we get on the highway, and we're maybe about 5 miles from the destination, and the lights start blinking on the car. And he's driving, but it seemed to me that it was slowing, that it had governed out at 40 miles an hour or whatever it was on the highway. So I'm in the back trying to get him to tell me which charging units he uses so that I can try to find one. There's not one near him. So then I'm Googling just any sort of charging unit in the town that I'm going to, and we find one. He doesn't have that app. As we're rolling in, I say, "Okay, just go straight to there. Don't take me home. I will walk home." And we end up doing that. We barely make it in there. He's signing up for the app and finally gets the thing plugged in at this public parking lot and says, "Ooh, it looks like this is a low power charger. And so it might take me an hour to get enough range back that I can get back to my origin point. And again, it was relatively late at night. It was cold. I gave the guy my cell phone number and said, I'll go home, but if you get stuck here, please call me and I will come rescue you. I don't want to leave you out here. And I just left that experience thinking that maybe that now is not the time for me to buy an electric car. And I say that I'm not someone who is against this technology. I, for several years, have had an electric string trimmer, and it's great. I don't have a whole lot of string trimming to do, so it's low maintenance. I recently had to replace the lawnmower, and I made the same calculation. I got an electric lawnmower. Again, I don't have a huge amount of lawn to mow, and it is not quite as powerful or as good of an experience as my old-fashioned gas Honda. But boy, it's nice not to have the maintenance to worry about. And so I look forward someday to owning an electric car and never again going in for an oil change. But I'm just concerned that today is not that day.
Well, you make a great point, Kyle. And it's not just that today might not be that day. It's that today might be never for some people, depending on, as you point out, their specific needs. And I think that's the frustration that I have with these mandates. There's nothing wrong with electric vehicles. And I think for some people in particular, those who live in a city environment in particular, they're driving short distances. Maybe they live in a place where the climate is pretty stable all the time. They have the option of charging it in their own garage overnight while they sleep, and it's ready to go for the short distances they need to go. Why not? And I, similarly to you, I've had experiences with electric tools. I mean, I have a little tiny electric chainsaw. Now, I also have some very giant gas-powered chainsaws because the little tiny electric chainsaw isn't going to let me cut down a whole tree. It will let me trim a few little branches here or there, and that's actually really useful because it's small and easy to use, and I don't have to pull on it to get it going, and I don't have to put the gas or the oil in it or mix the fuel, so great. But again, it isn't going to cut down the big giant tree for me. I had a similar experience. My husband and I went to go to a rental counter in Texas to get a car, and they tried to convince me I had ordered an EV. I quite firmly informed them that I had not and showed them my rental agreement. And it wasn't going to work for us. We were in Texas. We were about to drive great distances. I had no idea if or where there were any charging stations. And I'm assuming that that is a problem that Hertz is having, and why it's selling off a great number of this fleet is because everything is simply too undependable at the moment for people to take that risk if they're on a trip or trying to get to a business meeting. And it's going to be a long time before that changes. So John Kerry can suggest that, oh, people are making this up. But for anybody who's thought about it or had an experience with it, they understand that these are items that might be very specific and good uses. A lot of people are choosing not to have the unreliability of an EV because of what they need to do, climate, distance, whatever. And the suggestion that government can just make everyone like them and make them buy them regardless of what it does and upends people's lives is, I think, the pushback you're seeing.
Alicia, what do you make of John Kerry's broader record? He has been the special climate envoy since 2021. He is saying that he will soon step back from that role. He's 80 years old, but he intends to campaign diligently for President Biden on the topic of climate. And let's listen to another clip of Kerry. This, again, is in Davos, Switzerland, describing what he thinks he accomplished with regard to China.
China has brought a massive amount of coal plants online. And frankly, it's been one of the areas of discussion between us. But China is also manufacturing and deploying more renewables than all the rest of the world put together. So we have to see how this unfolds. We agreed to work with China in a transparent, constructive way, accountable. We're not giving up anything in doing that. But it's a way for us to make certain that we are all in this together.
Alicia, what do you make of that? Does that cut any ice?
Well, I think it's interesting because, for one, he does acknowledge that China has a lot of coal plants that continue to be under construction despite its promises to peak coal emissions by 2030. That doesn't appear to be likely to happen. But a lot of the coal plants it's building are actually to back up its solar and wind that it's also building, because solar and wind can actually provide very low cost energy or electricity on the margin, but they still need to be backed up. In the US, what Biden and a lot of the left there want to do is basically back it up with very expensive batteries. That's not what China's doing, because doing that is, again, it's about 6 or 7 times more expensive than just backing up with coal. And so China is building more coal and it's mining more coal in order to power its economy and in part of its industrial base. And ironically, that industrial base includes a lot of the solar panels, actually the wind turbines increasingly, that are now being used in the US to produce renewable energy. And by the way, that also includes the EV batteries especially, and critical minerals that we're still pretty dependent on China for, notwithstanding the IRA's subsidies to increase production of those in the US. So it's kind of ironic, because the reason why China has actually been forging into renewables is, one, again, as I said, that they can be cheap at the margin. And 2, because they see where the West is headed, and they want to essentially make Europe and US dependent on China for more things. It's figured out pretty well how to mass produce EVs at a low cost, whereas American automakers still haven't. And that's why actually China last year was the world's leading auto exporter for the first time, was because it was exporting so many EVs to Europe and also some of the other countries in the Indo-Pacific. But China is essentially using this as part of its industrial policy to export low-cost green energy to the U.S. The U.S. and Europe, which just can't compete, in part because of its own green energy mandates, which are raising the cost of power. So there are so many ironies and contradictions with what John Kerry is saying. It's kind of hard to keep them straight.